What would you do if the people who called themselves your family drove off into a snowstorm and left you standing in the road, and you understood? Watching the wagon wheels cut their last tracks into the white, that they had done it on purpose. For Adelaide Cray, 17 years old, this wasn't a question to turn over by the fire. It was the cold already climbing past her ankles, past her knees, while the tracks behind the wagon filled in with snow faster than she could follow them. She had exactly 3 things in her coat pockets: a stub of tallow candle, a folding knife with a chipped bone handle, and a small carved wooden bird no bigger than a walnut. Nobody in Larkspur Gulch would have given 2 cents for any of it. By the time the following spring thaw came, half the territory would know her name, and it would not be for freezing to death on Cache Pass. Before we get to how she survived that night, and to what she found buried in those mountains 15 years after the gold rush had come and gone and left everyone for dead or for dust. Settle in wherever you're watching this from, a porch, a break room, a bed at the end of a long day, and ask yourself something the mountains asked Adelaide Cray. When everything you're handed is taken from you, what's left that nobody thought to steal? She had not always been so alone. Adelaide, Dell, to the handful of people who'd ever cared to shorten it, was born in a cabin at the foot of the 10-mile range in the spring of 1857. 2 years before the first wave of gold-struck men came stampeding into the Colorado high country with pans and picks and a hunger that made them careless of everything, including each other. Her mother, Naomi, died of a lung fever when Dell was 6, and her father, Thomas Cray, a quiet freighter who hauled goods between the mining camps, never much recovered from it. He remarried 3 years later, a widow named Verlaine with a grown son named Roy, and the household that resulted was not cruel so much as it was simply indifferent to Dell. The way a man is indifferent to a fence post that happens to be standing on land he wants cleared. It was Dell's grandfather, Silas Kettering, her mother's father, who filled in what was missing. Silas had come west in '59, one of the first wave, a young man from Missouri with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and a partner named Jonas Vane he'd known since boyhood. Whatever happened to Jonas, Silas never said outright. He'd get a certain look, staring into the stove fire of an evening, and he'd say only that the mountains had taken more from him than they'd ever given. And that most men who talked about the gold rush like it was a grand adventure had never actually watched a friend die in it. But Silas had come out of those mountains alive, and what he brought back wasn't gold. It was knowledge, hard and specific, and he poured all of it into his granddaughter over the years he had left. He taught her to read a sky the way other men read a newspaper, the high mare's tail clouds that meant weather in 2 days. The way a certain green-gray light in the west meant snow within the hour regardless of season. He taught her to find water by the plants that loved its nearness, willow and sedge, even when no water showed itself to the eye. He taught her how to keep an ember alive in a tin for a day and a night without a flame ever showing, wrapped in punkwood and moss. So that a man, or a girl, need never be without fire even in a downpour. He taught her to read old blazes on trees, the pale healed-over scars where a prospector's hatchet had marked a trail or a claim line decades before. And how those marks weathered differently depending on how long ago they'd been cut. And he taught her, above everything else, patience, the particular, unglamorous patience of a man who has panned 100 miles of creek bed for a spoonful of color and learned to love the work itself, since the gold so rarely came. He gave her, too, on the last Christmas before he died, a small kestrel carved from aspen wood, its wings folded, its head tilted as if listening for something. Your grandmother used to say a kestrel can hover dead still in a wind that'd flatten a man, he told her, pressing it into her palm. It just reads the current right. You remember that, when the wind's against you. He was 71. He died the following autumn, quietly, in his sleep, and Dell inherited nothing from him on paper, no land, no money, only the bird, his old rock hammer with the handle worn smooth as river stone. A brass compass with a hairline crack across its face, and a story he'd never quite finished telling her, about a partner named Jonas Vane and a fortune the mountains had swallowed whole. Thomas Cray followed his father-in-law into the ground less than a year later, thrown from a freight wagon on the Buckskin Road. And it was in the weeks after his burial that Dell learned exactly how much room she occupied in Verlaine and Roy Cray's understanding of family, which was none at all. The homestead, such as it was, had been leased in Thomas's name, and Verlaine wasted no time informing the county that the family was relocating to a new claim over the divide. In country better suited, she said, to raising cattle than raising hopes. What she did not say, not directly, was that Dell would not be coming with them in any capacity but the barest, a mouth to feed on a hard passage over a mountain pass in late October. With an early storm already sitting low and grey over the peaks. Roy, 26 and resentful of a stepsister he'd never once called by name, put it plainer, the night before they set out. "You eat food we don't have to give you," he said, not looking up from his plate. "And you've got no more claim on us than a stray dog has." They left her at a bend in the road below Cache Pass, in country she didn't know. Telling her, with the particular cruelty of people convincing themselves they aren't doing what they're doing, that she could catch up on foot, that the wagon was overloaded. That they'd make camp just over the rise and wait. They did not make camp over the rise. By the time Dell understood this, the light was failing and the first snow of the season was coming down in earnest, and the wagon tracks she'd been following were already softening at the edges. Filling in, the way a wound closes over. Nobody in that wagon expected to see her again. That much, later, everyone in the territory would agree on. What they got wrong badly, was thinking that mattered less to her survival than it should have. She did not weep, not then. There would be time for that later, plenty of it, in the small hours of nights alone on the mountain. What she did, standing there in the thickening snow with the light draining out of the sky, was exactly what her grandfather had taught her to do, in the flat. Unpanicked order he drilled into her since she was 9 years old: find shelter before dark, find water before shelter matters, keep the ember alive no matter what else is lost. She left the road, there was no sense following tracks that led nowhere but away from her, and worked her way instead toward a stand of spruce she could see darkening the slope above. Because spruce held less snow underneath than open ground, and because a windbreak was worth more just then than a mile of forward progress. It took her the better part of an hour to build what her grandfather had called a snow trench, no bigger than a coffin and about as comfortable. Floored with cut spruce boughs so her body wouldn't leach its heat straight into the ground. She fed her ember tin with the last dry tinder in her coat and coaxed a small fire going in the lee of a boulder, cupping it with her body the way you'd shield a candle from a door draft. And she sat through that whole night listening to the wind work through the trees above her like something searching for a way in. She was cold in a way she had never been cold before, cold enough that her thoughts slowed and thickened, and more than once she found herself simply staring at the little carved kestrel in her palm. Turning it over, thinking of Silas telling her that a hawk reads the wind instead of fighting it. She did not fight the night. She endured it, the way you endure a held breath, one slow minute unspooling into the next, and when the gray light finally came up over the ridge she was alive, half frozen. And utterly alone in country that did not know her name. For 3 days she moved south and down, out of the high snow and into country where the aspens still held a few yellow leaves and the streams hadn't frozen at the edges. Surviving on rose hips and a grouse she managed to snare with a noose of boot lace. Thinking less about the family that had left her than about the simple mechanics of staying alive until the next sunrise. It was on the evening of the third day, half-starved and light-headed, that she stumbled down into a mining settlement clinging to a fold in the mountains called Larkspur Gulch, 40-some buildings. A played-out placer creek, and a population of maybe 300 people who had mostly given up on the gold rush a decade and a half before and simply never found a reason to leave. They took her in, more or less, the way a town takes in a stray, Mrs. Odell at the boarding house gave her a cot in the storeroom in exchange for scrubbing floors, and the town more or less agreed, without ever quite saying so. That the Cray girl was a hard-luck case not worth much curiosity. Word came through eventually, secondhand, that Verlaine and Roy had made their new claim over the divide and told anyone who asked that the girl had likely died on the pass, which was, as far as they were concerned, a closed matter. Nobody in Larkspur Gulch was unkind to Dell exactly. They were only the particular kind of indifferent that a hard place breeds in people who have used up most of their sympathy on themselves. She might have stayed that way, a boarding house girl scrubbing floors for her keep, quietly grieving a father, a mother, and a grandfather in a town that had already decided what she was worth, if she hadn't, one gray evening scrubbing out the ash box of the boarding house stove. Finally let herself remember the rest of what Silas used to say, late at night, staring into a fire much like this one. Now, before we go further into what Dell remembered and what it sent her looking for, ask yourself this: what's a story worth, if the man who told it never lived to finish it? Because that's exactly the position Dell found herself in, and if you want to see whether she finished it for him, I'd ask you to like this video and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight, because we've got a long climb ahead of us, and it helps to know who's climbing along. What Silas used to say, in those low fireside voices reserved for stories he only half wanted to tell, was this: that in the first summer of the rush, 1859, he and Jonas Vane had worked a claim on a nameless fork of a creek high above what would later become Larkspur Gulch, in country so remote that most of the stampeders never bothered climbing that far, chasing easier color lower down. And that in the last weeks before the passes closed for winter, the two of them had found something neither of them had words for at first, not just color in the pan, but a pocket, a genuine deposit. More gold than either man had seen in a year of scraping by. Silas never gave a figure. He'd only say that it was enough to change two men's lives twice over, and that instead of it changing their lives, it had ended one of them. An early blizzard caught them before they could pack out. Jonas took a fall on the ice trying to reach their cached supplies and broke his leg badly, and in the week that followed, snowbound in a half-built line cabin with a partner too injured to travel. Silas watched him fail: infection, fever, the slow kind of dying that a man in that country in that century had no tools to stop. Before Jonas died, he made Silas promise something Silas would only ever describe as seeing to what was owed, and made him swear to mark the cash so it could be found again, and to carry word out to Jonas's people back east if he ever could. Silas buried his partner as best the frozen ground allowed, blazed a hawk into the bark of a lightning-scarred pine standing where two creeks married into one. The way he and Jonas had always joked that the mountains themselves were pairing off, and then he walked out of that country in a grief so total that he never once, in the remaining decades of his life, found the will to walk back into it. The hawk stands where the waters wed, he told Dell once, the last time he ever mentioned it, the autumn before he died. That's all I ever wrote down of it. I always meant to go back. A man tells himself he'll go back to a grave before he tells himself he'll go back to gold, and then somehow neither trip ever gets made. Dell had taken it, at 9 or 10 years old. For one of her grandfather's fireside stories, no more literal than the ones about grandmother and the Northern Lights. It was only now, alone in a boarding house storeroom 15 years later with nothing left to her name but his tools and his teachings, that she understood he had been handing her something real. And that he had never gone back for reasons that had nothing to do with the gold at all. She did not decide all at once to go looking. It came on her slowly, over a hard winter of scrubbing floors and hauling water, the way a decision comes on a person who has run out of other decisions to make. What finally settled it was small and almost embarrassing in its plainness: an old-timer at the boarding house table, a retired freighter named Tobias Yarrow. Mentioned offhand one evening that he recalled a Kettering working a claim somewhere up past Notch Creek back in the early days, before it all went bust, and that there'd been talk once of a partner who never came down. It was the first outside confirmation Dell had ever had that any of it was real, and something in her, grief, mostly, though she wouldn't have called it that, decided that a story her grandfather had died still carrying, unfinished, deserved to be finished by somebody. She left Larkspur Gulch in the first thaw of the following spring, in April of 1875, with almost nothing: the rock hammer, the cracked compass, the carved kestrel, a wool blanket, a skillet, and provisions she'd bought with 4 months of saved wages, which did not amount to much. Mrs. Odell had called the whole plan foolishness to her face, and half the boarding house table had agreed with her. In that particular way people agree with each other about the failures of someone not present to defend herself. Dell didn't argue the point. She had learned, in the years since her grandfather died, that there was very little use explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were. The climb up out of Larkspur Gulch and into the high country above Notch Creek took the better part of 2 weeks, and it was here, more than at any other point in her life, that Dell understood exactly what her grandfather had given her, piece by piece. All those evenings she thought she was only being kept busy. The trail, where there had ever been a trail, had long since grown back over with scrub oak and deadfall, and she navigated less by any path than by the compass bearing and the shape of ridgelines. Checking the crack across its glass face against landmarks the way Silas had taught her, correcting for drift, trusting the instrument even when her own sense of direction argued otherwise. She read the sky each morning the way he'd shown her. And twice changed her planned route because a certain flatness in the western light told her weather was coming before a cloud had even shown itself over the peaks. The high country in early spring is not a gentle place. By day the sun came hard and thin off the snowfields, burning her face raw while her boots stayed soaked through from postholing in wet drifts, and by night the cold came down out of a black, star-crowded sky with a viciousness that made sleep a thing to be fought for rather than fallen into. She rationed her food with a discipline that surprised even her, ate rose hips and the inner bark of certain pines when the food ran thinner than planned, and kept her ember tin alive night after night the way Silas had shown her, never once letting it go cold. Because a fire in that country was not comfort, it was the difference between morning and no morning at all. There were whole days when the only sound in the world was her own boots breaking crust snow and her own breath fogging in front of her face, and in that vast, indifferent quiet she found herself talking to her grandfather out loud, low, the way a person talks to someone gone, telling him she was close now, that she remembered, that she hadn't forgotten a single thing he'd taught her even when she'd been sure at the time she wasn't listening. It was on the 11th day, following the compass bearing up a drainage that matched, as near as she could tell, the description of Notch Creek's western fork, that she came around a shoulder of granite and saw 2 streams meeting in a narrow meadow below a stand of old-growth spruce, the water running high and cold with snowmelt. And standing sentinel above the confluence, an ancient, lightning-blasted pine, its crown long dead, its trunk still holding. Now, if you've stayed with Dell this far, through the wagon tracks filling in with snow, through a night that should have killed her, through 11 days of climbing toward a story she wasn't even certain was true, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button. Because we are about to find out together whether her grandfather's hawk was still standing where he'd left it 15 years before, and whether what he buried beneath it was still there to be found. She crossed the creek at a shallow riffle, soaked to the knee in water so cold it ached in her teeth, and climbed the short slope to the old pine with her heart going harder than the climb alone accounted for. The bark was scarred in a dozen places by weather and time, but there, on the north-facing side, weathered nearly smooth but unmistakable once she knew to look for it, was the shape of a hawk with folded wings, cut deep enough into the cambium that even 15 years of healing hadn't erased it. Dell stood in front of that tree for a long while, one hand pressed flat against the bark, and let herself cry for the first time since the night on Cache Pass, not for the gold, which she hadn't found yet, but simply because her grandfather had stood exactly where she was standing, in exactly this kind of grief. And she understood him now in a way she never had while he was alive. The line cabin itself had mostly returned to the mountain. What remained was a low, moss-grown rectangle of collapsed logs, a chimney of river stone still half standing, and inside what had once been a single room, a floor thick with pine duff and decades of blown leaves. Dell spent the better part of 2 days simply searching the obvious places, clearing the collapsed hearth stone by stone, probing the old floor with the rock hammer's pick end, working outward from the cabin in slow expanding rings the way Silas had taught her to search a claim systematically rather than hopefully. And on the second afternoon, wedged into a gap behind the chimney's foundation stones where the mortar of packed clay had crumbled to almost nothing, her hammer struck something that didn't ring like rock. It was a small strongbox, iron gone deep orange-brown with rust, its hinges seized solid, no bigger than a bread loaf. Dell's hands shook prying it open with the hammer's flat end, shook harder still when the lid finally gave with a shriek of corroded metal, and inside she found not the fortune her grandfather had described, but a scattering of a dozen or so gold nuggets, pea-sized to thumbnail. Together worth perhaps $200 or $300 by the assay rates she'd heard talked about in Larkspur Gulch. It was real money, more than she'd ever held in her life. It was also, plainly, not what Silas had meant when he talked about a fortune that changed two men's lives twice over. She sat back on her heels in that ruined cabin with the small hoard in her lap and felt something close to despair. Wondering if this had been the whole of it all along, if grief and 15 years had simply inflated a modest strike into a myth, the way all such stories inflate with the telling. She might have packed up and started for home the next morning, satisfied enough with a find that would keep her fed and independent for a year, if she hadn't noticed. Turning the strongbox over in the last of the daylight, that its base was not solid but false, a second, shallower compartment beneath the first, sealed with pitch gone hard and black with age. It took her the better part of an hour with the knife blade to work it free, and what she found inside, wrapped twice over in oilskin that had somehow kept the mountain damp mostly at bay, was not more gold at all, not at first glance, but a slim, leather-bound journal, its pages foxed and curling, and beneath it, folded into a stiff square, a hand-drawn map showing the creek fork, the cabin, and a second mark higher up the slope, near a formation the map's maker had labeled only as the slide. The gold and the false bottom. When she finally reached it beneath the journal and the map, was a second, larger cache, enough dust and small nuggets, by her rough estimate, to be worth several $1,000s at any honest assay office, real money, life-changing money for a girl who had owned nothing but a wooden bird and a cracked compass a season before. But it was the journal, not the gold, that held her attention that whole first night, huddled by her small fire with the little book open on her knee, because the handwriting inside, cramped and slanting and unmistakably a young man's, was signed, on its very first page, Jonas Vane. The entries were dated across a single terrible autumn, September into November of 1859, and they began ordinarily enough, notes on color found in the pan, on weather, on a partner named Silas who snored something awful and who Jonas trusted with his life, which was, as it turned out, exactly what he'd end up doing. But the later entries, written in a hand that grew progressively weaker and more uneven as the fever took hold, turned toward something Dell hadn't expected. And it was these she read aloud to the empty cabin and the dark mountain beyond it, her voice low and unsteady in the firelight, because some words, she found, needed to be spoken to be properly heard. I write this not knowing if Silas will find it, or if I will still be here to see whether he does, Jonas had written, in a passage dated in early November, the ink gone brown with age. My leg does not improve and I have stopped telling Silas otherwise, for he is not a fool and it does no kindness to either of us to pretend. If these words are ever read by anyone, let it be known that whatever gold lies with this journal belongs first to my Mary and to our daughter Ruth, in Zanesville, Ohio, who I left with promises I am now ashamed to say I never kept the way I meant to. I told Mary the first would send for her within the year. I have sent for her within nothing but silence, these 3 years past, chasing color in creeks that do not care whether a man has a wife and a child waiting on him or not. Dell stopped there, the fire cracking low beside her, and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, because she understood, reading it, exactly what her grandfather had carried all those decades, not just the grief of watching a friend die slowly with no way to help him, but the weight of a promise made to a dying man. A promise to see gold delivered to a widow and a daughter he had never once managed to face, because facing them would have meant telling them how their husband and father had actually died. Alone in a line cabin, waiting on help that never came fast enough. The later pages were harder still to read aloud, and Dell's voice caught more than once doing it. Jonas wrote of Ruth as a small girl, 5 years old when he'd left, and wondered in one entry, with the particular clarity that seems to come to dying men, Whether she would even remember his face by the time she was grown, or whether she would only know him as an absence. The way a person knows a room by the shape of the furniture that used to stand in it. He wrote that he did not fear the dying so much as he feared being forgotten entirely. Folded into the mountains without a mark left anywhere in the world to say a man named Jonas Vane had lived and loved a wife and daughter and meant, every single day, to go back to them. His last entry, dated 3 days before what Dell now understood must have been his death, was only a handful of lines, the writing barely legible. Silas will see this reaches you if any man alive can manage it. Tell Ruth her father thought of her at the end and was not afraid, only sorry. Tell Mary the first loved her the whole while, even in my failing to come home to prove it. Dell sat a long time with that journal closed in her lap, the fire burning down to coals, thinking not of the gold at all but of her own father. Thrown from a wagon on a road he traveled 100 times before, and of her grandfather. Carrying this exact grief for 15 years without ever finding the strength to climb back up here and finish what he'd promised a dying man he would do. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully let herself understand until that night, that she and Jonas Vane's long-grown daughter Ruth, wherever she was now. A woman near 40 years old who might not even know her father's fate. Shared something across a gap of 16 years and 1,000 miles, both of them left waiting on men who meant to come home and never managed it. Both of them handed grief instead of the goodbye they deserved. The gold in her lap stopped feeling, in that moment, like a fortune found. It felt like a debt still owed, one her grandfather had died still carrying, and one she meant, before she ever climbed down off this mountain, to finally see paid. She spent one more day at the site, working the second mark on Jonas's hand-drawn map, the formation called the Slide, which turned out to be an old rockfall a quarter-mile upslope. Where a modest vein outcropping had clearly been the true source of the color the two men had found that summer. Still visible in the exposed rock face where frost and time had done more excavating than any pick could. It wasn't a claim she could work alone, not properly, not with winter still owning half the calendar in that country. But it was, she understood, looking at the raw seam of quartz shot through with visible color, a genuine strike. Exactly the kind of thing her grandfather had described and never lived to see confirmed. She marked the location carefully in her own hand alongside Jonas's original map, gathered the journal, the gold, and her tools. And started the long walk back down out of the mountains toward Larkspur Gulch, carrying more weight in that pack than she had carried going up, and a good deal more purpose besides. She came down out of the high country in early May, weathered and thin and utterly changed from the boarding-house girl who'd left 6 weeks before, and Larkspur Gulch. To its credit and its shame both, did not know quite what to make of her. Mrs. Odell fed her before asking a single question, which was more kindness than Dell had expected. But the town at large treated her return the way a town treats anything it can't immediately categorize, with a wary, gossiping curiosity that stopped well short of belief. Nobody quite called her a liar to her face. They also didn't, most of them, offer to help her file a claim, or to pack mules up a mountain on the strength of an old journal and a girl's word. What Dell understood, sitting again at Mrs. Odell's kitchen table with her small hoard of gold laid out plain on the oilcloth, was that she did not need Larkspur Gulch to believe her. She needed it to work for her, and those, she'd learned from her grandfather without ever being told outright, were two entirely different propositions. She took a portion of the first cash's gold straight to the assay office run by a precise, ink-stained man named Obadiah Finch, who weighed it out with a professional's indifference to the story behind it and told her plainly what it was worth, and it was Finch, once the assay came back honest and substantial, who became the first person in town to treat her as something other than the hard-luck Cray girl. She paid him, in coin, for his time and his discretion both, and asked him, as a matter of business rather than friendship, whether he knew of anyone reliable enough to help stake and work a genuine claim. He sent her, in turn, to a woman named Constance Ruiz, who ran the town's livery and blacksmithing along with her late husband's old partner, a broad, unhurried man named Tobias Yarrow, the same retired freighter who'd first mentioned a Kettering claim over supper the winter before, and who took considerably more convincing than Finch had. Right up until Dell laid Jonas Vane's journal on the table between them and let him read the entries himself. Dell did not ask any of them for charity, and was careful, in fact, not to. She paid Connie Ruiz in advance for the loan of 2 pack mules and her own considerable experience with mountain travel. Paid Tobias a wage out of the first cash to guide and to help with the physical labor of proper excavation, and hired, at Finch's recommendation, a taciturn young surveyor named Hollis Pratt to see the claim filed correctly and legally in her name before anyone else got wind of color in that country and came stampeding in the way the whole territory had stampeded once before. It was slow work, that spring and early summer, hauling supplies and equipment up a mountain that had nearly killed her the season before. And there was nothing instant about the trust that grew between the 4 of them on that climb. Connie Ruiz was closed-mouthed and practical, more interested in whether Dell could hold up her end of a hard day's labor than in her story. And it was only over the shared exhaustion of the ascent, splitting the last of the coffee 3 ways, working side by side to free a mule that had gone down in a scree slope, that something like genuine regard began to grow up between them. The unglamorous kind that gets built entirely out of shared work rather than shared sentiment. Tobias, for his part, warmed slowly, the way an old man warms to a thing he's half embarrassed to admit he believes in, and it was he who finally said aloud, standing at the base of the old blazed pine with his hat in his hands, that he remembered Silas Kettering well enough, and that he was glad, after all these years, someone had finally come back to finish what the man had started. They were 3 weeks into properly working the outcropping at the slide, clearing rock, opening a modest adit into the vein, confirming color rich enough to justify real investment, when the trouble Dell had half expected all along finally found her. It came, as it so often does, wearing a familiar face. Roy Cray rode into their camp on a lathered horse one gray afternoon in late June. Having heard secondhand through a chain of loose talk stretching all the way from Larkspur Gulch back to the claim he and his mother had staked over the divide, that the stepsister they'd left for dead on Cache Pass had turned up not only alive but sitting on a gold strike. He did not come to apologize. He came, plainly and without much pretense, to claim a share of it, arguing loudly to anyone who'd listen that the Cray name and the Cray blood entitled him to what a Cray girl had found, regardless of who had actually walked up that mountain and who had left her to die in it. What followed was not the kind of dramatic gunfight the old dime novels liked to print, but it was tense enough in its own quiet way. An argument that stretched into a standoff at the mouth of the new adit, Roy insisting on his claim with the particular loud confidence of a man unused to being told no, and Dell standing her ground with Tobias and Connie flanking her, neither of them saying much, both of them making abundantly clear through simple presence that the girl was not alone this time. It was Hollis Pratt, in the end, who settled it plainest, producing the properly filed and witnessed claim papers that bore Adelaide Cray's name and nobody else's, and informing Roy, in the dry language of a surveyor rather than a man picking a fight, that Colorado territory law cared a good deal more about who had filed a legal claim than about who shared a household with the person who'd found it. Roy blustered a while longer, threatened a legal challenge he plainly had neither the money nor the standing to mount, and rode out at last with nothing but the same bitterness he'd arrived with, leaving Dell standing at the mouth of a mine that was, for the first time in her life, unambiguously and legally her own. Word of the confrontation traveled back down to Larkspur Gulch faster than Dell herself did, carried by a supply runner who'd witnessed the tail end of it. And it did more in a single week to change the town's estimation of her than 6 weeks of quiet, honest work had managed. The story that spread was not, in the end, primarily about the gold, though the gold certainly helped it along. It was about a girl left to die on a mountain pass by her own family, who had walked back into those same mountains alone, found what her grandfather had died still grieving, and stood her ground against the very people who'd cast her out. By the time Dell came down into town that August to properly register the claims yield with Obadiah Finch, the same townsfolk who'd murmured about hard-luck foolishness the spring before were the ones tipping their hats to her on the street, and Mrs. Odell, not typically a demonstrative woman, hugged her hard enough at the boarding house door to leave a mark. There was one piece of the debt Dell had not yet paid, and she saw to it before the summer was out, sitting at Finch's own desk to write a long, careful letter to Zanesville, Ohio. Addressed to whichever Vane family members might still be found there, enclosing a portion of the claim's proceeds along with Jonas's own unsent words, copied out in her own hand from the journal. So that Ruth Vane, wherever she now was, a grown woman near 40, might finally learn what her father had wanted her to know 16 years too late, that he had thought of her at the end. That he had not been afraid, only sorry, and that he had loved her mother the whole while even in failing to come home and prove it. Dell never received a reply that summer, nor for a long while after, but she mailed that letter with a settled feeling in her chest that she recognized, eventually, as the closest thing to peace she'd felt since her grandfather died, the particular piece of a promise finally kept, even secondhand, even 16 years overdue. By the time the first snow of that next winter came down over Larkspur Gulch, softly this time, watched from behind a real glass windowpane rather than endured in a snow trench on an open mountainside, Dell Cray had built something out of what the mountain gave her that went well beyond the gold itself. The claim at the slide, properly worked through the following spring and summer with a small crew Connie and Tobias had helped her hire, proved out steady rather than spectacular. Enough to make her genuinely independent without ever making her reckless, and rather than simply banking the proceeds. Dell put a good portion of them into building a way station at the base of the Notch Creek Trail, a solid log structure with a real hearth and a stocked larder. Meant for exactly the kind of traveler she herself had once been, cold, lost, and unprepared for country that did not forgive carelessness. She ran it herself through that first winter, with Connie's help and occasionally Tobias's grumbling company, and it became, within a year, the kind of place travelers spoke of with real gratitude. A lit window in hard country where a person could get warm and fed and pointed the right direction before the mountain had a chance to teach them the same lesson it had once tried to teach her. It was on a quiet evening the following autumn, a full 18 months after the night she'd nearly frozen on Cache Pass, that Dell found herself alone on the way station's porch at dusk. The same time of day her grandfather had always favored for his stories, the sky over the 10-mile range gone the deep gold orange it turns in that country just before the light fails entirely. She had, tucked in her coat pocket as she always kept it now, the small carved kestrel Silas had given her that last Christmas, its wings still folded, its head still tilted as if listening. And she took it out and turned it over slowly in the fading light, the way she had 100 times on that mountain when the cold seemed like it might be the only thing left in the world. She thought, watching the light go, of everything that mountain had actually given her, and understood, in the plain, unsentimental way her grandfather had always favored over grand pronouncements. That the gold had never really been the inheritance at all. The gold had bought the way station and the mules and the claim papers, and it had let her pay a debt 16 years overdue to a woman in Ohio she would likely never meet. But the true inheritance, the thing Silas Kettering had actually left her, long before she ever knew there was a fortune buried anywhere, was the plain, hard-won knowledge of how to endure a night that should have killed her, and the patience to keep walking toward a story nobody else believed in, and the understanding, finally arrived at on a cold mountainside 18 months before, that a person left with seemingly nothing could still be carrying, in her own two capable hands, everything she'd actually need. The gold wasn't the fortune. What her grandfather had spent all those quiet evenings teaching her, that was. Thank you for climbing this mountain with Adelaide Cray tonight. If her story found something in you, if you've ever been the one left behind, told you were worth less than what you carried, I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know. And if you'd like to walk into the next hidden inheritance with me, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another story buried out there in that old frontier ground, waiting on someone patient enough to go looking for it.